Okay, well, let's get started. I'm so excited to be presenting the second phase of our Midnight Lunch Team Read, which is being sponsored by the AWE group on LinkedIn. That's AWE, Alternative Work Environments. So Mike, you are on the line with me here today, and I'm so delighted to be part of this program.
Yep. It's a pleasure, Sarah. I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your, and I know how hectic your schedule is at the moment to do these 4 webinars. Certainly last week's one was fantastic. I'm looking forward to this week's one on creating context and team dialogue. And basically, if you're ready to go, then I'm more than happy to sit back and watch this. But I would say one thing, please, for participants, please feel free to comment, send your questions through. We had some great dialogue last week, and I'd like to continue that because it's such an important topic and it is so relevant at the moment.
Well, I'm excited about this conversation regarding context and its relationship to collaboration. It's a very significant topic for organizations today, no matter whether they're large or small. So let's get started and talk a little bit about some of the background of Thomas Edison as an innovator. Many of you were part of our conversation last week when we talked about phase 1 and creating collaboration capacity. But today we're going to talk about the next phase, phase 2 of collaboration. So I will be reprising some of the ideas that we touched on last time, but also covering some new material. One of the most extraordinary things I learned about Edison when I was researching his life and achievements was that he was born before the Civil War and died during the Great Depression. So he lived during an extraordinary 84-year time span that embraced good times in the economy as well as difficult times. So there's a lot that we can learn from how Edison navigated some of these difficulties, and as well how he put his teams together so that they could be successful in a variety of business environments. I love some of these pictures here of Edison. We see him in the upper left here as a young man and travel through the course of his career to the time when he was actually a very accomplished and world-renowned scientist and inventor, as you see some of those images on the lower portion of the screen. One of the most favorite things I have as a child is thinking back to some of the stories that I heard about Thomas Edison as I was growing up. I was in first grade when I learned that I was a great-grandniece of Thomas Edison. And you can see this gentleman here in the lower left, who is my great-great-grandfather, Lewis Miller. He was an inventor and had 92 patents during his lifetime. Most of his work was in agricultural equipment, and he was very prolific in the 1800s, the mid and late 1800s, and some of his inventions are actually in the Smithsonian. So if you get to Washington, D.C., you could actually go there and see some of his Reaper binder machines, which are still on display. So if we think about what the legacy was of this extraordinary man, he had 11 children. And the 5th child, whom you see here in the middle section here, was Mina Miller. She actually married Thomas Edison in 1886. So Mina was an extraordinary woman. She was 20 years old at the time she married Edison. Edison was much older than she at age 39. But his first wife had passed away, and Mina married Edison and helped him raise his 4 children, who at that time were ages 14, 12, and 10. So Mina really did extraordinary work both as a mother and as a companion to Edison. So she's one of my heroes, my great-great-aunt, all the work that she did allowing Edison's genius to really blossom. In the upper right, you see a picture of my grandfather, Robert Anderson Miller, who actually invented shatterproof glass at Pittsburgh Plate Glass shortly after World War II. So a very extraordinary achievement in and of itself, and ushered in a new era of inventing and innovating in the U.S., a time when innovators were actually mostly within organizations and didn't have their own labs as Lewis Miller did and as Thomas Edison did. So a unique look at how innovation and invention has changed over the course of some 100 years. Very interesting legacy to grow up with. One of the things that has fascinated me ever since I was in the business world and working in the Global 500 is how people can be successful at collaboration. And a new book that I've written, which I know you all have a copy of, called Midnight Lunch, offers us a guide to how we can take some of the methods and processes that Edison used as a successful collaborator and bring them into the 21st century. I've just been very intrigued with how Edison would adapt some of his thinking if he were with us now in the digital age. So a great deal of what Midnight Lunch reviews is what are some of these translations? What are some of these methods that we can engage in now as leaders and executives in the modern workplace? There was a great article about Midnight Lunch in Fast Company, and I urge you to take a look at it when you have an opportunity. It's a wonderful recap of the book itself. The link is shown there, and I think it's just a nice way to a great summary of the book itself and the 4 competencies of collaboration. One of the things we talked about last time in our conversation was the Menlo Park Lab as a collaborative workspace. This was a very unique setup that Edison had, and it was a way that he actually established the capacity for collaboration to exist. We can see the way he laid out the workspace was quite unique, kind of a long rectangular shape with all kinds of bottles and equipment along the side, and then tables and work benches, if you will, for people to engage in their experiments individually, and also offering them the ability to see each other's experiments as they looked down the room. One of the unique things you can see at the very end of the room there is actually a pipe organ. You can see the pipes kind of sticking out the top there at the left of the organ. This was something that everybody used during midnight lunches at the lab itself. So it was a time when people were sharing their experiments, sharing their insights, and actually socializing as well. So we talked a little bit about what a midnight lunch was last time, and we can certainly reprise that in our conversation today. Here is an example of one of the individual workspaces at Edison's second large laboratory, the West Orange Laboratory. And this is a different scale. You can see this is a smaller space, allowed for people to work alone, but then also draw in team members together so that they could talk about what they were working on and share some of their insights with a sense of immediacy. So people could step out of these spaces and call others in. Very interesting way of generating engagement, but working in solitude as well. If any of you have been to the west coast of Florida, you may have seen Edison's Botanic Laboratory, which is another example of this very collaborative workspace that he designed. You can see how tactile this is. There are all kinds of machines here. You can see belts hanging from the ceiling toward the left in this photograph. There are also individual vials of compounds. Edison had gardens growing outside this laboratory, and he would actually step out and draw in plants and flowers from the laboratory, from the gardens that he would use in his experiments. So bringing people into these spaces was a big part of how Edison began his collaboration process and how he encouraged people to connect and have dialogue. Part of what is extraordinary about this process is that collaboration actually was the backbone of Edison's innovation approach. And we can see some of the fruits of what Edison delivered during his lifetime. Here is a list of the 6 industries that Edison pioneered in less than 40 years. We start with document duplication and telecommunications, and then move down to recorded sound, electrical power, the movies, the storage battery. These are all technologies and industries that we're familiar with today. So not only did Edison create billions of dollars in market value through these industries, but he delivered for us a type of infrastructure that remains in the modern era. So part of what we can look to is Edison's approach to collaboration as something that is timeless. There are methods that he adopted which we can begin translating for our digital era. And last week when we talked about phase 1 of collaboration, we talked about creating collaboration capacity. You can see the link here to the actual YouTube recording, which is now posted and online. So any of you who may have missed last week's session can just tap in this link and you'll be taken to the YouTube page that has some of that information. And I will also post this on the AWE LinkedIn page today. We are recording this session, so you'll have a chance to tune into this, and others who are away will have a chance to access the archives. But most of what we'll talk about today is how we create context around collaboration. What does it mean when we are together and having dialogue, having team engagement? What are some of the things that happened in Edison's labs and his manufacturing facilities that were so extraordinary and unique? Next week, we'll talk about coherence, which is phase 3. That will be April 26th. And in a little bit here, I will give you a chance to see the link to register for that in case you haven't done so. And as well, phase 4, which will be the last of our Team.Read sessions on May 9th. We'll talk about complexity in that conversation. So let's take a look at context and give a sense to our discussion here about what context is and how it's different from just plain problem solving. I think a lot of us view innovation as a problem-solving process, and indeed it is. But Edison actually thought about it in a slightly different way than most of our activities today. So what we look and can see in Edison's notebooks is his comments about collaboration as a discovery learning process. And we see him specifically comparing discovery learning to task-based learning. And most of what we do today, I think, is often focused around tasks and things which are specifically time-bound. But part of what we need to do as collaborators today is to move away from that and balance it with the discovery learning process, where we have both performance and tasks engaged in what we're doing. Some of what Edison was also looking at involves complexity. And again, we'll talk about that when we get to phase 4. But I think what you'll see as we talk about the notion of context is that it has multiple facets. It's not necessarily a linear construct. It's something that enables us to really use our ingenuity and to draw upon the best of the way our minds are wired to think. One final point here as we think about collaboration and context is the notion of a common goal. This is part of what spurs the dialogue that we're going to be discussing today. How does dialogue really happen, and why do we want to have this dialogue? Part of it has to do with the fact that collaboration itself revolves around a common goal or a shared purpose that a given team is endeavoring. So let's begin with some of the foundations of how Edison established context. And if we begin with the process that Edison himself used, we begin with what I call in Midnight Lunch the solo meld. And this is really a unique approach, something that I haven't seen anywhere else in other reading that I've done on collaboration. And that is that we actually have to prepare as individuals for collaboration. We need to do some reading, we need to have a point of view and have some thoughts in our minds as we begin the collaboration process. This doesn't mean that as an individual that you'll have the answer or that you'll have the solution, but what Edison felt was important was that everyone who was part of a collaboration had something that they felt they had an insight on as they were beginning the collaboration process. I talk a little bit about this in the Phase 2 section, and you can specifically have a look at pages 103 to 104 if you happen to have a hardcover version of the book. If not, you can look in the Phase 2 section and focus on mental models. This is a way that we can begin to prepare our minds for the collaboration process and begin to look at how we as individuals actually filter information. Sometimes we have specific experiences which may color how we come to a collaboration process or how we come to a particular subject. So you can see how Edison looked at the notion of his own thought process. There are 5 or 6 points that I outline in this section on the way Edison actually felt he was viewing the innovation process. One of my favorite comments is, "I am open to new phenomena." So there's an exercise in this section that you can use to actually begin seeing what some of your filters are as you think about innovation and collaboration. Do you have an open mind when it comes to learning information from others? Do you have specific points of reference that might limit the way you are able to receive information from a collaborative group? So have a look at that section and think about your own mental model and some of the filters that might be in play as you approach the collaboration process. One final thought here on the solo meld. Edison often prepared for collaboration by reading. He had an extraordinarily large library, and I'll show you a picture of that shortly. Edison had a 3-story library at the West Orange Laboratory facility, and he not only engaged in reading himself, but he also encouraged his employees to read. So think about the last time you were in a team setting or in a work setting where someone that was the head of your collaborative project actually encouraged you to read, not only related to subjects at hand for the problem you were looking at, but also more broadly, just to become an interested reader, someone who is interested in taking in information from the wider world. So reading was a very significant part of Edison's preparation and helped him prepare questions for the collaboration process. This is a wonderful shot of the West Orange Laboratory library. You can see the 3 stories here. It was very ornate and decorated with all kinds of maps and objects. It was a very tactile place that didn't just have books, but had other ways for people to take in information. So a terrific place for solitude and a great place for people to just escape and be able to do some of that reading I described and work in their notebooks to write down their insights and prepare for their collaboration efforts. One of the biggest parts of collaboration that comes beyond the solo meld stage is what I call group meld. And in Midnight Lunch, I talk a lot about the importance of casual team dialogue, not just dialogue that is spurred by formal meetings or agendas, but dialogue that takes place informally, in informal settings. I talk about Kevin Dunbar's studies and some of the work that he did in the last 10 years to look at how scientists that have created breakthroughs actually shared their insights and how they came forward with some of the radical ideas that shifted the thinking of their colleagues. And he talks about the importance of these informal gatherings, meetings that were really just called together to talk and to share. They didn't have specific requirements about time. They didn't have specific agendas related to who was going to be the leader and so on in these sessions. So it's very important that as part of our work week and our collaborative settings that we create, that we bring forward the possibility of informal dialogue. I talk more about this you can see these page references here, pages 122 to 125, if you'd like to do more reading about that. But some of how Edison reinforced this was through his midnight lunch process and the notion of casual team dialogue that took place after hours. That's really when midnight lunches were taking place in the lab. If you listened in last week, you heard me talk about the fact that sometimes Edison would return to the laboratory after the dinner hour and look at his experiments, monitor how they were faring, and also talk with others in the lab about how their experiments were progressing. So during this time, they would share information, troubleshoot each other's experiments, and also share food. About 9 o'clock, Edison would order in a meal for everyone who was present. Typically, there'd be about 10 people there. And during this time, people kind of let their hair down. They would sing songs, tell stories. I mentioned the pipe organ a little bit earlier. Often they would play music together. This was a time when people really weren't, quote unquote, on. No one was evaluating them. And they really felt like they could share and offer some of their deepest insights. So casual team dialogue is something that Edison promoted at many different times of the workday itself. Here is a quick view of another workspace within Edison's lab. This is a way for casual dialogue to take place when people were actually making prototypes and making tools or other equipment. You can see some of the machinery set up here. Again, a very large space where people could see each other and actually pass information along as they were working, walk over to other people's workstation, and just establish some conversation. So another way that Edison reinforced casual dialogue in his Menlo Park laboratory. I wanted to just draw forward some of the workspaces that we see today. And perhaps in our question and answer section, we can talk about how modern workspaces either do or do not generate the kind of dialogue that Edison had in mind. I thought this was a very interesting layout here for a workspace. You can see, again, it's very large, much as Edison liked his workspaces to be for a group setting. There's some computer equipment along the left here. Obviously, some workspaces with tables in the center of the space. Lots of light with the external windows there. People moving through the space and having a chance to exchange conversation. So I thought this was a very interesting and representative workspace for some of how Edison might set up a collaboration space in his workplace today. Here's another setting where we see people engaging socially and having dialogue across tables, small places for teams to work. This type of space may look familiar to many of you. I've started to see more and more of this type of space in the travels that I do and working with teams across the U.S. and outside the U.S. You can see how informal this setting is. There's actually, it looks like a food space in the back there for people to get beverages and also to eat. So it kind of reminded me of what a midnight lunch space might actually look like today. One of the most important things that Edison did as he was beginning these casual dialogues was to ask questions and, in fact, form what I call master questions. One of Edison's hallmarks was his ability to understand what other competitors were asking, people who were looking at similar questions to him and similar challenges to what he was looking at, but to ask different questions than they were. If we think about the ability that Edison had to create innovation breakthroughs, some of this comes from his ability to ask master questions that differed from the questions others were posing. In looking at his work with the incandescent electric light, for example, most of his competitors were asking the question, what will burn the longest? They were looking at compounds in terms of how long they would last if, in fact, they were heated to a point of burning. But Edison actually asked a different question, which was, how do substances burn? What are the qualities of burning? So in asking this question, it actually led him to experiment with different compounds than his competitors had examined. So if we look at Edison's notebooks, we can see him experimenting with bark, with boar bristles, with thread, with hemp and rope fibers, natural compounds, types of things that one wouldn't even imagine to include in a set of experiments of this nature. But what Edison realized by asking this question was that what he was looking for was evenness of burning, and the ability of a substance to burn evenly, even if it was impregnated with something else, another substance like carbon, or if it was twisted or reformed or reshaped in some fashion. The evenness of burning needed to be present. So this is how Edison actually conquered the challenge of incandescence in a way that was so different from his competitors. So think in your own work. Are you asking questions? Are you beginning with questions? A lot of times we want to begin with solutions or begin with ideas. But Edison, in fact, formed context around the problems he was solving by forming master questions first. From there, Edison would continue to expand the context of his thinking by creating hypotheses. Now, we learn about what it means to create a hypothesis in grade school and middle school. We learn about if-then statements. But Edison used these in a very prolific way. And I think sometimes we aren't creative enough in the hypotheses that we may create around a problem that we're tackling. Edison was very creative about the types of questions he would pose, or the situations, rather, that he would pose in his hypotheses. And in doing so, he cast himself forward in time. So his hypotheses were actually helping him create a future context, a context for things that didn't exist yet. So when we talk about getting into ruts, when we talk about, oh, I feel like I'm always thinking in the same patterns, my ideas seem to be coming from the same place, form a hypothesis. See if you can actually think more about the possibilities of what could exist rather than what exists now. This was really, again, one of Edison's hallmarks. The final statement that you see here on this slide, if I can capture sound mechanically, then I can create a commercial market, was one of the most important hypotheses Edison created around the phonograph and the development of recorded sound. He didn't know exactly how he could mechanically capture sound, but using this hypothesis along with others guided him to create grooves in substrates that captured the vibration of sound and transformed it into a surface that would hold the sound and allow it to be replayed over and over again exactly the way it had been recorded. So this was a huge shift in thinking, that sound from the human voice, from instruments, could actually be captured in a mechanical way. So hypotheses are crucial for casting us forward in time and allowing us to think in different ways. Another crucial facet of how Edison created context was through prototyping. I mentioned earlier that Edison didn't like to start with solutions, but he liked to start with approaches that were going to give him multiple scenarios, multiple ways of thinking about a concept or a process. And prototyping was a great way for him as well as his team members to capture their thinking in multiple formats. So much of what you saw in the workspaces that I showed you briefly allowed for the creation of three-dimensional prototypes, things that people could pick up, they could hold, things that were made of brass and metal or wood. They were made of paper in some instances. But three-dimensional prototyping was a big way that Edison was able to capture his thinking and then share it with people. So we can do this today in many ways, many facets. Rapid prototyping is something that has gained a lot of popularity. This is a process when people can be just sitting with construction paper, duct tape, pens, pencils, markers, any type of found object, and actually just construct something with glue or tape or whatever might be at hand that represents the idea or concepts that they have in mind. A lot has been written about this, and I think it's a fascinating way of capturing the thinking of a group and watching how it shifts over time. In Midnight Lunch, I also write about narrative prototypes. And this is an interesting form of prototype that Edison also used. This was a way for people to capture the stories and the verbal descriptions of what they were working on and share these descriptions with others, whether within the team or beyond the team. Narrative prototypes are an especially important form of prototyping today because we often don't have the time to physically construct something. As well, if we're working in a software environment or an environment that relates to services, narrative prototypes can be an excellent way to actually capture what we want an experience to yield for a user. I talk a little bit about this on page 136 in the hardcover edition of Midnight Lunch. I talk about the notion of Japanese gardens and the experience of walking through a garden as something that is a sort of an analogy to what a narrative prototype allows. It allows an experience to unfold. It allows ideas to emerge with no particular logical pattern, but with an emotional connection. Part of what a narrative prototype does is creates an emotional connection to a project or an idea, which is extremely important to capture as the team is progressing through its collaboration exercises. One final thought here on prototyping has to do with digital prototypes. One of the things I know that Edison would have loved to do is to capture some of his work digitally. And we can see this in some of the simulation programs that we can capture today. Some of the more common ones might be CAD programs or CAD-CAM programs in putting together instruments or machines in a blueprint fashion using computers. But we can also step people through sequences and imaginary scenarios. For example, at the Mayo Clinic, they use simulations for first responders to help physicians understand what kinds of conditions they might face in a real-life setting, but actually step them through that process in a digital format. So it helps not only with the cost of simulating real life, but also with the speed with which these prototypes can be developed. So prototypes were a very important part of Edison's ability to create context. So just a few points of summary here. In pulling together this notion of dialogue and getting context developed in a collaborative setting, Edison was very active in encouraging the individual to prepare for collaboration through reading and also through examining their mental model, how they think, what types of thought processes they like to go through in a collaborative effort. He encouraged team dialogue in a very casual setting. He wanted people to come together not just to fulfill an agenda, but also to have casual discussions. And in those discussions, generate questions, look at hypotheses, identify some of the things that would be possible. This is part of where I think today sometimes we screen out some of the possibilities a little bit too early. If we don't ask questions or generate hypotheses early in the process, sometimes we screen out possibilities too soon. And finally, prototyping. What can we do to represent the idea? How can we bring this context that we're describing into some kind of narrative framework, emotional framework, physical framework, or digital framework? These are very compelling ways to draw a collaborative conversation into a focus. And finally, the work environment itself. You saw from some of the images that Edison was very powerfully creating work environments that encouraged collaboration every day. There were lots of places that people could go in the laboratory and in his manufacturing environments as well to collaborate and engage in some of these practices. So what I'd like to do now, Mike, if we could, is perhaps take some questions. I somehow have lost my panel, so I'm not able to actually see some of the questions, but it would be wonderful if you might be able to read some of these out. so that we can hear from some of the folks who are on the line and get some of their thoughts and input.
Yeah, Sarah, unfortunately it appears as though we've got a gremlin in the system. My question box doesn't appear to be working, so we don't appear to have got questions that have come through. One thing that we can do, and this is, I'm just sort of thinking on the fly here, we can address some questions through OR. Maybe if we go from OR to from here to OR in the next sort of 10 minutes, we can actually address some of the questions that have come up in this. How does that sound?
Sure. Yeah, we can go online to the LinkedIn group and work through this that way. That's a great idea.
Yeah,
so,
one of the things that I actually have a question. Yeah, there's a lot in there, and by the way, thank you first and foremost very much for doing this. It's a great presentation. What about one of the things that you mentioned around collaboration is the common goal. And I think there's a really big problem in the modern organization. A lot of people, because of the way organizations are structured, and again, this sort of comes back possibly to the pyramid structure of an organization, the jobs that they do are highly sort of defined, and they don't really touch other parts of the organization. So really understanding the common goal is, I think, a huge problem that we currently face and have faced for a long time, but I think it's becoming, with the pace of business and social business, I think it's really important that we understand how we can overcome that and work more closely together. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's an excellent point, and I know in some of the project work that I've done with executive teams in large organizations, this is a particularly thorny issue. One thing that I'm finding is that in looking at how to create common goals, by creating master questions, it actually begins galvanizing people around similar thrusts and similar topics. I think sometimes we write out goal statements, or we have statements of work that are governing an entire year. These statements of work can be very different from one division to another. But if there are actually 3 or 4 master questions that in fact all the divisions are working toward, I found it to be very unifying. And people actually can come together more readily around questions and addressing common questions than they can around goal statements. So this has been an interesting area of learning where I see some of the silos that exist in large companies kind of coming down, and reducing some of the hierarchical feeling that can surround what people are tasked to do in their work days. So by looking at master questions and identifying what some common master questions are, this notion of shared purpose and common goals comes to the fore.
Yeah, no, that to me is so important nowadays, and it's something that I see doesn't happen enough in a lot of the organisations that I've worked with and been in. The other point I wanted to address was asking questions differently. That's almost a fundamental change in belief patterns about how people interact with each other.
Yes.
And we could even reduce it to, it's not where we work, it's sort of, but how do we work would be sort of one of those questions. What's your thought on that? How can we encourage people to start asking questions differently? Because I think when you're trying to move from point A to point E, there's B, C, D in between, and I see that as a fundamental part of how we can change work environments. What's your thought on that?
Well, I think some of what needs to happen is that leaders themselves need to be asking questions more openly with their teams. I think the way leaders are acculturated, and this goes back to graduate school and MBA programs and all kinds of learning that takes place over the course of our careers, is it's believed that leaders have the answer. So I think when we can start to hear leaders asking questions of people and actually being collaborative in that process, It will begin to model a different mindset. This is some of what we see happening more and more around social innovation. If we think about some of the work that we see happening in entrepreneurial spaces where new views of markets are taking place, if you will, some of the bottom of the pyramid conversations, the Grameen Bank notion of micro-lending. If we think about tackling challenges in rural India or rural Africa, some of these kinds of discussions begin with questions. They don't begin with solutions. So I believe if we can see more modeling of asking questions in the workplace, that it will begin to create a greater shift on how our mindset operates this way. A second thought I would have on this, and I just gave a speech in Washington, D.C. earlier this week to several leaders, and they were talking about MBA programs and graduate programs needing to be refashioned so that, in fact, we begin to ask questions first rather than trying to generate solutions first. So I think some of it comes also in our environment and how our educational system works and how we're actually prompted to believe that solutions are generated. So I think it's going to take time, but there's some early beginning points that I think we can look to.
Yeah, that's great. You also mentioned, and I just want to tap on this point because I think this is really so important. The whole idea of being open to new phenomena, but also addressing the emotional side, not just the physical side. And it appears to me from basically last week and this week that Edison did both equally. The physical workspace was set up to be conducive to collaboration, but the emotional side of the workplace was also set up to conducive to collaboration. And the no leader sessions that you mentioned in your slides was something which we talk about nowadays, but he was doing back in those days, and that is something that I think is really key to actually creating collaboration, i.e. taking away some of the structure and some of the hierarchy so that people can actually really collaborate. So what's your view on that?
I think that's hugely important, and this gets to some of the comments on decreasing social distance or those perceived boundaries that exist between people based on their tenure, their rank in the organization, how long they've been with a company or in a particular industry. This is a very important facet of leadership and executive work today. I think more and more, we see this at Google and Facebook, at Amazon, increasingly at places in the laboratories at 3M and other large companies. This notion, as you say, of the leaderless team, people actually sort of opting in to work on projects that are of interest to them, in which they also have expertise to offer. So a lot of times we assign people to teams. And I think sometimes this creates some of the hierarchy that you've described. It can create a false sense of who's the leader and so on. So looking at teams from a different vantage point, that there will be leaders who will emerge in the process, and we'll actually talk about that in phase 3. That's part of Edison's focus on coherence, how microcultures arise in companies. The notion of shoulder-to-shoulder leaders is something that I think is very important today. It doesn't mean that you have to be a vice president to be inspiring a team or to leading it forward in action. You can be someone who is able to navigate certain questions rapidly. The way we show our expertise is actually different today. And I think this is a big part of where teams are going, and it shifts how we think about leadership.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. There's so much insight that you bring to the table here, and it goes to show that the concepts that we're talking about aren't new concepts. And when people say, well, we can't work that way, or we haven't worked that way, or who does work that way, Edison was doing this back in the day. And to me, the point of of being able to display that to people is really, really important, as opposed to the fact that this is not a net new concept or not a net new way of doing things.
Exactly, and you mentioned earlier the notion of the emotion behind projects, the emotion that exists in a team space. I think this is part of what we're working with when we talk about innovation culture or a collaboration-focused culture. Some of this is emotion, and we have to take that into account as part of what drives collaboration. And again, this was a big area for developing context in Edison's world. It was part of how he created conversation around the projects he was working on. So that emotional framework is very significant. And as executives and leaders today, we need to be recognizing that and using it as part of how we guide teams in the collaborative effort.
Yeah, no, I fully agree, and some great points there as well. I would like to let other people ask some other questions. Obviously, we don't have the capability at the moment to do that, so let's go to Orr. And if I'm just going to start off a discussion, and let's see where we can address some of the questions through that medium. How about that?
Perfect. So I will head over to the AW site right now, or to the AW page rather, on the internet. And if you are on LinkedIn, you can simply go to linkedin.com and sign in using your own username and password. You can search on the AW group if you're not easily tapped in or are able to get there. And that way we can all connect and have some further dialogue over the next 10-15 minutes.
Sounds great, Sarah. I've already started a discussion, so let's go over there.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.